The psychological reason Daniel Dubois returned to Don Charles, or the tactical reason Dubois went back to Don Charles. Here's a question to you. What would you do if you was Don Charles? Would you reject the offer, or would you take Daniel Dubois back? For me, from my perspective, if I was rejected and then asked to come back, for me, the price would go up and I would want some type of formal commitment, contractual commitment. Think of it like this. If a manager fired you, they fired you and perhaps they didn't respect you, and then they asked you to come back, would you say yes? Would you say no? Perhaps there isn't a right or a wrong answer. Perhaps it's context. What was the reason for them letting you go? Maybe they did respect you, or maybe they didn't. And maybe that doesn't matter. What's more important? Is business just business, or does integrity matter? And what is the level of your integrity? Are you consistent with your integrity? For me, it felt like an outsider looking in, that Don Charles wasn't getting the respect that he deserved. That's from an outsider looking in. Perhaps that's not the correct perspective. Of course, we will never fully know because we're not behind closed doors. Here's a theory, or here's a perspective. Daniel Dubois realized Don Charles's value when he left, or he only realized his value when he left. I think maybe some of us can relate to that. Sometimes you might be doing a job and you feel like you hate the job and you leave the job. So you hate the job, which by default means you don't value it. But then you realize that either you value the job or maybe you value the paycheck attached to the job. Because you lose the job, you lose the culture, you lose the paycheck, you lose that collaboration or relationship with customers, with professional partners, etc. Obviously, the nature of the team or the nature of the work will determine the relationship you have with either clients, colleagues, etc. But let's go back to the boxing context. And obviously, we've got different players in this game. We've got Don Charles, we've got Daniel Dubois, we've got Daniel Dubois' father, and then we've got Tony Sims. And why did it not click with Tony Sims? What was the reason behind that? Was it the culture of the boxing environment? Was it the teaching? Was it the father relationship? Because many people have implied or suggested that Daniel Dubois' father is a hard person to get on with. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but that's what's being purported. And who was not happy? Was it Tony Sims? Was it Daniel Dubois? Was it the father? Or was it all three? Or did Tony Sims feel that he might have liked Daniel Dubois, but didn't feel that his fighting philosophy was the appropriate philosophy? Or maybe he felt he couldn't maximize Daniel Dubois' talent. But this goes back to that question. Should Don Charles have accepted? Should he have accepted it? And will he now get the credit that it appeared that he didn't get initially? Will Don Charles deep down question Dubois' loyalty? Again, let's go back to that analogy. Imagine you're working for the person who fired you. There's evidence that they will fire you. So if they would fire you, why wouldn't they fire you again? Let's play devil's advocate. Don Charles created a heavyweight champion, got paid well and got exposure. So maybe it's purely transactional. Yes, there might be a lack of loyalty, but there's a lot to gain here. In that sense, does the end justify the means? Meaning if I work a job and get paid well, does the process matter? That depends, doesn't it? Because some people, they could get paid 100 grand a year, but if they hate the job, their happiness is more important. Maybe what's more important than that is if you have prospects. If you hate a job that's well paid, but you can get another job that's well paid, then that job has less control over you. But if you feel that this is the only job that you can get, or the only well-paid job you can get, then maybe you conform and sit in the misery that has been created, sometimes we consensually enter the houses or the environments that we hate. We consensually engage with it. And that's a terrible thing, because the question becomes, what's the cost of your happiness? And again, does the end justify the means? If you're getting paid really well, then yes, you hate work, but then can you still love life? If your life outside of work is so good because of your financial capacity, does it matter? Or is it bearable? And to a certain degree, you can argue that within life, there's always a trade-off. There's always some form of pain, and we should accept that. And for Don Charles, that's an individual question. Everything is subjective. How much is a lot of money? To some people, 100 grand is like loads of money. To some people, it's minuscule. And I guess because there's still an engine behind Daniel Dubois, there's still a financial investment. He will be compensated for his labor, compensated for his time. From my perspective, if I was Don Charles, I would want financial leverage, but maybe more importantly, I would want the respect. It's important that people value what you do. It's quite objectively obvious what Don Charles brought to the table. He was part of making Daniel Dubois a champion. Obviously, Daniel Dubois did the fighting, but he created that boxing environment where he flourished. And remember, he was coming off a loss when he got with Don Charles, and he had a sequence of victories, and then that sensational victory against Anthony Joshua. So I would want the fruits of my labor to be acknowledged, respected, truly respected. It's important to value the people that you work with. Think of this. What is the impact of being devalued? If you work a job and you're devalued, will that impact your feeling towards them, your feeling towards yourself? And isn't it just part of being a good human being that if people do right for you and produce you results, not only are they financially compensated, but they are acknowledged? Because if you go to work and you were treated badly, how does that feel? And how can you sit okay with that? If someone helped you get to a particular success and you don't acknowledge it, perhaps that says a lot about the person who doesn't acknowledge it. And for me, if I was to work with someone, that context would have to change. So what is Daniel Dubois' potential? What is his potential? Under the right circumstances, I believe he could be a champion again. I think that Daniel Dubois has genetic talents. He has speed, power, and experience, and generally a good IQ. However, that boxing IQ needs to be developed to be able to stay at championship level. So I think it's important when you look at fighters, or when you look at boxers, it's always important to ask the question, what needs to be improved? What needs to be improved? Let's look at this metaphorically. Think of this. Let's say a salesperson is working for a company and they're closing 20% of their sales. The obvious improvement would be, how do we get the sales conversion to 25%? How do we get it to 30%? How do we get it to 35%? So we need a strategy for that, and then that strategy needs to be implemented correctly. Let's think of in a boxing sense, when you take Lennox Lewis, when he made his comeback, and you think, okay, you could improve his boxing IQ, which was improved under Emmanuel Stewart. You could improve the consistency of the jab. So just those two things there can create an exponential effect on someone's career. They can go from being good to great. And obviously there's subtle nuance changes. For example, with Lennox Lewis, he used to jab with his right hand here, and Emmanuel Stewart made him place his right hand here to exchange jabs. And if a left hook come, then he would just put the right hand here. So he had the way he would place his right hand was different under Emmanuel Stewart than it was against Pepe Correa. And that placement helped Lennox Lewis, that transition in style, that technical nuance. So when we look at Daniel Dubois, getting back to the initial question, what needs to be improved? Again, I think with boxers, there's various things. So you might need to improve the speed. You might need to improve the jab. You might need to improve their output. I think Daniel Dubois is good on those fronts. I would say that there needs to be an improvement on adaptation, which is a crucial part of ring IQ. And this is something that needs to be worked on in camp and something that needs to be worked on in fights. You need to be a student of the game. Here's another philosophy. I think it was Abel Sanchez that said, the boxer needs to grow, but also the trainer needs to grow. Trainers often adopt the position of fighter development. But what about the prospect of a fighter and a trainer getting better day by day? So it's the belief that there is a level playing field in terms of both need to evolve. Think of this. Mastery, you could argue, is a constant apprenticeship. There are always new things to learn. So even if you're the master, you're still a student because there's still the capacity to learn every day. You never say, oh no, I've learned it all, so I don't need to learn anything else. So it's important to consistently improve the boxer, consistently improve the boxing environment, consistently improve the operations of the camp, etc. It's important to have that mentality. So then this leads to the question of who should Dubois fight next. I think there's a good argument for a tune-up, primarily to build confidence and to practice combinations, to practice certain things and to, build his leverage with regards to his mind. So I think that's essential. With other fights, you have some really interesting prospects. I would say the Fabio Wardley fight is a dangerous fight. Not sure that Fabio would accept that fight, but it's potentially a good money fight. It has good cultural impact, but it's very high risk because Fabio Wardley is a very hard puncher and he sets traps up effectively and he's riding a wave of confidence. Then you have the Zhang fight, which has, I would say, a risk, but not as high a risk as Fabio Wardley, because Zhang might have some psychological scars from his recent loss where he was stopped. I think it's a good money fight because Zhang is a global brand. And there's a viral opportunity here because if you can stop or knock out Zhang, that will create a viral moment and that will create attention. And then you have other fights which you would favor Dubois to win, and these can have cultural and good financial implications. And this would be Dillian White and Derek Chisora. These are British household names. These would be good fights. They could have great marketing, and they would potentially have great marketing and also would be a good scrap. So we have a variety of options, and all these options would help Dubois move forward, building his brand, building his virality, and ultimately building his confidence. So going back to what we were talking about, which is Don Charles, I think it's important that this relationship is, for want of a better word, is transparent. It's important that there's no hard feelings. It's important that, it's a professional relationship, and naturally boxer training relationships can be very close. They can be very spiritual, for want of a better word, or emotionally intimate. And it's important that when you place so much faith in a trainer, that trainer is felt comfortable. So if I was in Daniel Dubois' position or in his father's position, I would want to assert the respect to get the most out of the trainer. Because if the trainer feels resentful or hurt, then that can affect psychologically his services, even on an unconscious level. So it's important that relationship is repaired. And once that relationship is repaired, then they can continue to evolve and continue to build Daniel Dubois. It's important that there's respect on all levels. The boxer respects the trainer respects the boxer, and also a respect for the father, because the father has a very important role. Daniel Dubois has a very close relationship with his father. This is not a bad thing. This is a good thing. But it's important that relationship is nurtured in a positive way. Because if it's not nurtured in a positive way, That will affect Daniel Dubois' relationship with the trainer. It will affect his relationship with the father, but it will also likely affect his performance in the ring. So let's get into some boxing news. And first, I want to talk about Usyk and Lennox Lewis. Now, many people consider Usyk as a legend. He has had some great dominance in the heavyweight division. And many speculate, how would he do against boxers from different eras? Lennox Lewis was a great fighter, undisputed champion, and was dominant. And they asked him how he would have done against Usyk. So I have a quote from Lennox Lewis. And the quote is, I would have compared Usyk to Evander Holyfield, and I think he would have done very well. I don't think he would have lasted against me because I throw a mean uppercut in there, and I notice he gets caught with uppercuts. End of quote. So Lennox Lewis here is predicting a win. I guess the byproduct of that is that he thinks he'll win by stoppage. Now, there is a variable to this. There was a rumor that Lennox Lewis did not like to fight southpaws, but this is a rumor. However, if that premise is true, well, Usyk is a southpaw and Lennox Lewis doesn't like to fight southpaws, so that's favorable for Usyk, assuming that premise is true. However, strategically, with everything else taken into consideration, this would have been a very hard fight for Usyk because Lennox Lewis knows how to fight tall, so to speak, and he knows how to utilize his reach, and he is a boxer with high IQ. He has very good feints, good counterpunching, and if he's under the guidance of Emmanuel Stewart, he is very hard to beat. To me, the variable would be Usyk's southpaw position and Usyk's elite counterpunching. However, I would argue that Evander Holyfield is an elite counterpuncher, a very good counterpuncher, and Lewis did very well under those circumstances. Also, Evander Holyfield presented a test where he tried to minimize Lewis's jab and Lewis's right hand, but Lewis was able to still have some success. So I think that this would have been a good fight. I think it would have started off as a strategic fight, very high boxing IQ, but then it probably would have evolved into a brutal fight. It's a hard one because Usyk's a great fighter, Lennox Lewis is a great fighter, but objectively, all I would say is that it would be very hard to beat Lennox Lewis, very difficult to beat Lennox Lewis. But when you look at Usyk has never been defeated, so it's always hard to visualize how an undefeated fighter would be beaten because there's always that prospect of maybe he's got another gear. But that would be a very, very hard task for Usyk. Now let's talk about heavyweight boxing. Now, Frank Sanchez and Richard Torres' deal for an IBF eliminator is apparently being targeted for late March of this year. Now, Sanchez has a lot of talent, but let's talk about Richard Torres. Now, Richard Torres is like a southpaw Tommy Morrison. Now, without being disrespectful, he's like a southpaw Tommy Morrison with regards to his stance, minus the finesse of the left hook and less power. You may be able to draw some other comparisons like Joe Frazier. Again, not the same power, but a relentless engine, high punch output. And again, maybe there's a slight parallel to a particular version of Michael Moorer, who was also a southpaw fighter and a pressure fighter. Not sure if he has the power and ring IQ of Michael Moorer. Not sure. Michael Moorer, obviously, I believe was he the first undisputed heavyweight champion, or was he the first the first southpaw heavyweight champion? I'm not sure. I believe he was the first southpaw champion, but I might be incorrect about that. But there are some favorable comparisons that Torres can be proud of. Mainly I see Torres dipping low. He really changes levels. He has a low center of gravity. But then I've seen him in some fights. He does try to box as well. So it's, he's a fighter that has a lot of promise. He's unbeaten, doesn't know how to lose, I believe. So he definitely presents a puzzle. Frank Sanchez, however, is I think, like a defensive first fighter. And I would say he's a counterpuncher. Now, when I think of counterpunching, I think of a variety of people. The main one I think of is Evander Holyfield with that right-hand counter. He's so proficient in that. But then you can argue that Lennox Lewis was a good counterpuncher, a different type of counterpuncher. And then you've got Riddick Bowe. And of course, you have James Toney, who is definitely a masterful counterpuncher. You can also put Bernard Hopkins in that department of great/good counterpunchers. Again, I think Sanchez has a lot of potential. I think he's defensive first, and the Caballal loss, I think, provides a blueprint on how to beat him. However, I think there was some context to that defeat because he had like a knee bracelet. So that would indicate to me that he had maybe some type of injury that he was carrying. I think with me, Sanchez has ability, but the question would be, is Sanchez's psychology? So if I was working with him, I would be like, look, we need to really work on his toughness and his resistance, as well as continually developing his IQ. He's got a good jab, good counter-punching skills. There's a lot to like. With regards to that fight, I slightly favor Sanchez, but I wouldn't be surprised if Richard Torres won. But we don't know how good either of them are. But I think Richard Torres we have less of an understanding of Richard Torres. So that's an interesting fight. And then we have, and I can't pronounce the champion, apologies for that, but Josh Kelly versus Bakram, who is defending the IBF title. Now, when we speak about Josh Kelly, he's a high-skilled, defensively responsible fighter, I would say, like a reflex boxer. And he has a good coach in Adam Booth. So that means he will be prepared. I feel like Adam Booth is good strategically, and he's good for building good boxing environments. He had, famously, he nurtured most, if not all of, or the majority of David Hay's career. So he nurtured David Hay. He nurtured David Hay in being a cruiserweight champion and a heavyweight champion. Amazing achievements. Now, going back to Josh Kelly, he is the underdog. And I think the reason he's the underdog is because there's the question of how has the loss to David, he lost to David, and I can't pronounce the person's second name, but how did that loss affect him? And I believe he lost within 6 rounds, and he was put under a tremendous amount of pressure. So there's questions about his psychology, not questions about is he tough, but questions about how can he prosper under those conditions where a fighter is putting intense pressure on him. Now, I think the general rule of thumb is that when a fighter or a boxer loses, it has a massive psychological negative impact on them. But there is a small context of where losses can make you better. Let me give you an example. Obviously, we had Muhammad Ali. He lost to Joe Frazier, came back, beat Frazier twice, had the famous victory against George Foreman. That's an obvious example. Then we have Sugar Ray Leonard, who lost to Roberto Duran, came back with a better strategy and was successful and had multiple successful retirements. And then we had Evander Holyfield, lost to Riddick Bowe, came back and was successful in the rematch. And then he had other successful returns, the most famous one against Mike Tyson. And then, of course, we had David Hay, who lost early in his career to Carl Thompson. But this was actually an essential part of David Hay's development. So just because you lose doesn't mean that you're finished, but it means that you have to be psychologically very strong. I think that he has a good trainer, a good boxing environment. So if anyone can nurture that, or if anyone can enable a boxer to make that transition, you would have to put Adam Booth up there. Like I said, he's a man of great knowledge. He's passionate and obsessive by his own observation about boxing. So we're wishing Josh Kelly all the best for his title attempt. And hopefully he will be successful. So this is the end of the video. I'm trying to build a digital boxing community. So I'm interested in your insights, your questions, and your observations, and I'll try to interact appropriately. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to support, like, and subscribe, and if you want to see more videos like this, click either here or here.